Article on Space Deception or Analysis of the First Manned Space Flights. Slightly paraphrasing Mikhail Zvanetsky. You can break the law of Earth's gravity, but it costs a lot of money. The law of universal gravitation costs even more money. In the United States, the key is finding the right person to pay. Once you do, give them the money and you can leave. The launch will be broadcast on all channels. The investigation into the early stages of manned spaceflight should primarily be seen as a training ground. If you can't figure out events that happened just 50 or 60 years ago, then on what basis do you think you can judge events from 100, 200, 300 years ago, or even 1,000 years ago? There is a lot of information about manned flights. Many direct participants are still alive, and you can ask them questions. The time that has passed contributes to the declassification of many documents. Older people can compare their childhood impressions with the results of the investigation, and so on. That is, unlike the times of the War of 1812 or ancient Egypt, in this case we have ideal conditions for training a historical tracker. Investigators have a somewhat ambiguous saying: before you start, look at the end. First, I'll put forward my version, which at first glance will probably seem too radical to many, even to those who have already figured out the United States lunar hoax. Developing the psychological effect from the launch of the first artificial Earth satellite. In 1957, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics embarked on the path of manned flights and demonstrated leadership in the exploration of near-Earth space. At first, the United States of America struggled like children, just like we did, and then they outdid the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics by staging fake flights to the moon. They lied to their own people and to the whole world. The leaders of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America came to the conclusion that mutual exposure was undesirable and cemented the lie with the fake joint project Soyuz Apollo. 1975. Real manned flights in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics began in 1967 with the Soyuz spacecraft, and in the United States of America in 1981 with the space shuttles. Thus, the first person in the world to actually fly into space was VIP. Shirap M. Komarov on the Soyuz 1 spacecraft in 1967. The first person in the world to successfully fly into space and reach Earth orbit was Georgy Beregovoy on the Soyuz 3 spacecraft in October 1968. The first United States astronauts who actually visited Earth orbit were there from April 12 to 14, 1881. Exactly 20 years after the claimed flight of Gagarin on the reusable transport spacecraft Columbia. According to the program, John Young and Robert Crippen, I don't have the goal of specifically convincing anyone of my point of view or playing the game of believe it or not. Rather, it's a symbiosis here. Interested readers get information about investigation methods. And it will be very useful for me to test not only the method itself, but also how it is perceived and whether it is presented correctly. On this index page, the historical investigation method will be laid out step by step, so that anyone can independently evaluate the arguments and draw conclusions about the credibility of official statements about manned flights. Step 1. We determine the boundaries of credibility. In accordance with the principles outlined in the articles The Retrograde Method of Historical Research on the Harmfulness of Antiquity and Leverage Points in the Swamp of History. We start from the present, and as applied to the history of manned spaceflight, we initially get the following boundaries. We accept the United States manned flights under the program as reliable, and thus we question all previous claims. The United States manned flights before the first flight of Columbia under the program, which took place on April 12, 1981, we accept the manned flights of Russian Soyuz series spacecraft on R-1 family rockets as reliable, and thus we put all previous claims under review. The Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' manned flights before the first flight of the Soyuz 1 spacecraft, which took place on April 23-24, 1967. Thus, we put three groups of manned space flights under suspicion in reverse chronological order. Block number 1. The United States manned flights to the moon in 1969-1972 on Apollo spacecraft. Block number 2. The United States manned flights in Earth, orbit on Mercury, Gemini and Apollo spacecraft. Earth orbital testing, flights to the Skylab orbital station, the Apollo-Soyuz project. Block number 3. Manned flights of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics in Earth orbit on the Vostok and Voskhod spacecraft, from Gagarin's flight to Leonov's flight. Anyone who, after examining the arguments for all the sections, comes to the conclusion that the claimed manned flights were falsified will, in fact, arrive at the version I presented at the very beginning. The easiest case is the block of American flights to the moon. Almost every single detail has been analyzed, although there are also detailed studies on the block of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics' first flights. Regardless of whether the reader comes to the conclusion of falsification or not, in any case, there will be great benefit from getting acquainted with the history of astronautics, acquiring skills in organizing information, broadening one's horizons, learning physics, and so on. In addition, this investigation is a good test of one's ability for rational thinking and willingness to give up simple belief in imposed stereotypes. The American dissident David McGowan spoke about the lunar hoax in this way. In any case, a lot of people are extremely reluctant to give up their belief in the success of the Apollo missions. Many people, in fact, simply covered their ears at the mere mention that the moon landings were faked and refused to even consider that possibility. And yet, among the faithful, there are some who will accept it. And although they firmly believe that we really did land on the moon, they might be able to understand that it was a hoax. That is, the lunar hoax can serve as training and a springboard to understanding and realizing the fact that there is global deception in our world promoted by government agencies of many countries. For if National Aeronautics and Space Administration manage to pull off such a blatant deception in front of the whole world and then keep this lie intact for 4 decades, what does that say about the control over the information we receive? What does it say about the mass media, the scientific community, the education system, and all the other institutions we rely on? That they will tell us the truth? What does that say about the very structure of the world we live in? In fact, the lunar hoax didn't come out of nowhere. It was just a logical continuation of previous falsifications, only on a smaller scale and not so blatantly contradicting the current level of space technology development. Step 2. Systematic study of events beyond the boundary of credibility. We should keep in mind that the initial stage of rocket and space technology development was primarily for military purposes, means of delivering nuclear warheads, reconnaissance satellites, communication satellites, and so on. Hence, secrecy, disinformation, legends, cover stories, and other methods of misleading adversaries about real capabilities are completely natural. In addition, the space race between the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America had a very high political component, which forced both sides to showcase their achievements at any cost. So, given the unreliability of launch vehicles from the 1960s and other space technology, falsifying achievements in manned spaceflight was a relatively inexpensive, safe, and most importantly, extremely effective way to fight the information war during the Cold War. We analyze the substantive part of the information from a technical point of view. We look at the genesis, the origin of the technologies, the preceding level of technology, as well as the subsequent applications of the equipment and technologies. We pay attention to inconsistencies that do not fit into the technically explainable development of the stated events. First, a launch vehicle is created that is potentially capable of putting into orbit a spacecraft with the mass required for manned flights. Second, unmanned vehicles. At the same time as improving the launch vehicle, the process of launching unmanned automatic spacecraft into orbit and returning them from orbit is being worked out. 3. Biosatellites. As the launch vehicle and unmanned spacecraft are improved, it becomes possible to send living creatures into orbit to study the effects of weightlessness, overloads, life support systems, and more. 4th, manned flights. When success is achieved in the reliability of the launch vehicle, the required payload capacity, the life support systems of the spacecraft returned from orbit, and other important factors, there are grounds for cosmonaut flights. Let's immediately draw attention to 2 circumstances. All suspicious manned flights miraculously avoided disasters and human casualties, which is very strange, especially for the initial period. All disasters with human casualties occurred during the period of manned flights within the established boundary of credibility. Between the flights suspected of being fake and those considered real by the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America, there were significant periods without any flights. For example, in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, flights under the seemingly successful Vostok-Voskhod program suddenly stopped, and there were no launches for 2 years. Up until the first real manned flight of Soyuz 1 in 1967, during which V died during descent. In the United States, they suddenly shut down such a grand and successful program of flights to the moon. And since 1972, there have been no manned flights there. Up until the shuttle flight in 1981, if you don't count the single fake participation of Apollo in the joint program of 1975, analysis of United States flights to the moon block, number 1 of the fake moon landings, has already been examined in such detail that only someone who simply believes, is too lazy to read the analysis, or is incapable of logical thinking can continue to believe in them. Nevertheless, it is necessary to give a brief overview in accordance with the stated investigation rules. Let's set aside for now all the discussions about the waving flag, whether there should be stars in the photos, and other assessments of National Aeronautics and Space Administration is visual artistry. That comes absolutely last, if anyone is still interested by then. After studying the technical specifications of the flights, from a political prestige standpoint, faking the moon landings was very important for the United States at that time, just to outshine the United States Soviet republics in something impressive. Between 1961 and 1965, under the Ranger program, 9 kamikaze spacecraft were launched. Their mission was simply to hit the moon and transmit images during their descent until impact. 3 years after the start of the Ranger program and 6 failures, in 1964, the first image of the moon was obtained. The next 2 Rangers also successfully transmitted images. Before crashing into the moon, Americans learned how to hit the moon, deliver spacecraft weighing about 300 kilograms there, and take photographs automatically. And the program was completed after March 1965 and 66 and 67. The program was a series of 5 automatic orbital spacecraft weighing about 385 kilograms, launched by the United States to map the lunar surface and scout possible landing sites for the Apollos. All 5 missions were successful, and 99% of the moon's surface was photographed with a resolution of 60 meters. Or rather in 66-68. The Surveyor program was aimed at exploring the surface of the moon with soft landings of spacecraft weighing from 1,000 to 1,300 kilograms. 5 out of 7 spacecraft succeeded in their mission. On January 7, 1968, the last Surveyor 7 was launched. The results of the United States unmanned flights to the moon as of January 1968, the delivery of spacecraft with a maximum mass of 1,300 kilograms to the moon has been mastered. The placement of spacecraft into a specified lunar orbit has been mastered. A large number of photographs of almost the entire surface of the moon have been obtained, including selected areas with high resolution. Some data on the properties of lunar soil and the space surrounding the moon have been obtained. Automatic soft landing on the moon has been mastered. At the unmanned stage, this was not accomplished. No launch from the moon was carried out, and not a single spacecraft was returned to Earth. That means technologies for return flight correction and other necessary procedures for subsequent re-entry at second cosmic velocity have not been developed. Second, the unmanned stage was simply skipped. Not a single living creature was sent to the moon by the Americans, not even irretrievably. That means life support systems weren't tested. The effects of radiation on living organisms weren't studied, and so on, not to mention returning to Earth. It should be especially emphasized here that during this same period, the Americans were launching biosatellites into Earth orbit. The one launched in 1966 burned up during re-entry, while the one launched in 1967 with insects and bacteria was successfully returned to Earth. So having completed the unmanned lunar program in January 1968 without returning a single spacecraft from the moon and without sending a single living organism around the moon, the Americans already launched in December of that same 1968 Apollo 8, which supposedly made the first manned flight around the moon in human history, and supposedly for the first time in the world, people returned to Earth at the second cosmic velocity. Fundamentally, this technological breakthrough looks even more impressive than the difference in mass between the 1.3 tons delivered to the moon by Surveyor in January 1968 and the supposed 45 tons of Apollo 8 in December of that same year. The falsity of the American flights to the moon is conclusively proven by the entire body of evidence currently available about National Aeronautics and Space Administration's technical incapability at that time. And even in 2014, National Aeronautics and Space Administration officially acknowledged the absence of lunar technologies. Basically, to establish the fakeness of the moon landings, it's enough to have just one argument: the absence of a launch vehicle with the claimed power. As if the super powerful F1 engine couldn't develop the claimed thrust. For comparison, on the left is the defocused plume of the low-temperature flame from the American kerosene engine, and on the right is the beautiful focused plume of the Russian kerosene engine RD-180, which the Americans buy from Russia. For more details, see the article American Lunar Kerosene Stove. For evidence of the failure of an engine with such calculations, see Article A. Velurova, the Great Carburetor. Ivchenkov in the article Review of Article A. Velurova, the Great Carburetor, concluded that the calculation of regenerative cooling was performed by A. Velurov did it competently, based on proven methods. Between the first of the extreme events of the lunar rocket launches and the second extreme return, the rest of National Aeronautics and Space Administration is technical inconsistencies in the middle should be considered. A lot has been written about the fake technical aspects of the American flights to the moon. Not just a lot, but a whole lot. See the far from complete collection, The United States Moon Hoax, link repository. Here, we will briefly look at some of the blunders of the second final event, the return of the astronauts from the moon. Ablative shielding, unreal landing accuracy at second cosmic velocity, which still can't be achieved in Russia, and at first cosmic velocity. Popov, in the article Super Precise Splashdown of the Apollos, another link in the lunar bluff, writes, according to National Aeronautics and Space Administration data, lunar Apollos numbers 8, 10 through 17 splashed down with deviations averaging plus or minus 2 kilometers. That is, the target area for the Apollos was supposedly extremely small, 4 kilometers in diameter. Our Soyuz missions, even now, 40 years later, land with 10 times less accuracy. Although the descent trajectories of the Apollos and Soyuz are physically the same in essence, a direct descent like the Soyuz would be incompatible with the life of Apollo astronauts due to the overloads. But this kind of two-skip descent results in a landing point spread of hundreds or even thousands of kilometers. So, if the Apollos had splashed down with an accuracy that's unrealistic even by today's standards using the direct scheme, the astronauts would have either burned up due to the lack of quality ablative protection or died from the overloads. But the astronauts in the Apollos are not just alive, they're actually in great shape. They just didn't know yet about the harmful effects of prolonged weightlessness. The real Soviet cosmonauts did. After just 5 days in weightlessness, they experienced severe coordination problems, and after 17 days, they had to move around on stretchers for a week. For more details, see Popov-Bodriaki, National Aeronautics and Space Administration from orbit. And all because the American astronauts, after pretending to board the spacecraft before the rocket launch, were actually hiding in a special bunker. See the articles Space Führer Günther Wendt and the National Aeronautics and Space Administration Astronaut Bunker. They had to deliver the Saturn V, which put about 47 tons of payload on a trajectory to the moon. Right after the automatic stations, National Aeronautics and Space Administration sent to the moon the highest form of life, brave American guys who were cheaper than any monkey without even sending a bug around the moon first. National Aeronautics and Space Administration sends a monkey for some unclear reason into some unclear layers of Earth's atmosphere for exactly the amount of time needed to fly around the moon. After that, the monkey dies within a few hours, showing all the signs of radiation sickness. On the other hand, 9 days before people are sent to the moon, a monkey returns from space, sick for not very clear reasons, and dies. The American heroes set off on their flight, shouting "Hooray!" It was utterly ridiculous. After the Apollo 1 tragedy, National Aeronautics and Space Administration launched a series of 3 unmanned spacecraft to test the ship's systems in spaceflight conditions. On November 9, 1967, Apollo 4 was launched with a full-scale mass model of the lunar module. This was the first flight test of the Saturn V launch vehicle. The mission's objective was to test the re-entry vehicle as it entered the atmosphere at a speed of 11 km per second, close to the second cosmic velocity. On January 2, 1968, Apollo 5 was launched with a mock-up of the lunar module. The mission's objective was to test the spacecraft's propulsion system and to study the dynamic loads on the lunar module under spaceflight conditions. On April 4, 1968, Apollo 6 was launched with a mock-up of the lunar module. The descent module test involved atmospheric re-entry at nearly 10 kilometers, close to the second cosmic velocity. The mission's objective was to test the control systems of the spacecraft and the lunar module. On October 11, 1968, Apollo 7 was launched, which was the first manned spacecraft launched under the Apollo program. It was an 11-day flight in Earth's orbit, the purpose of which was comprehensive testing of the command module and the command and service module. On December 21, 1968, Apollo 8 was launched, and on December 24 it entered lunar orbit, making the first manned flight around the moon in human history. In general, it's some kind of circus with horses. They couldn't fly to the moon, they couldn't come back alive from the moon. Everything that was claimed between the launch and the return is complete nonsense. You can look for signs of forgery just for fun, but only for fun. Analysis of United States near-Earth manned flights. Block number 2 of the United States is fake near-Earth orbit flights has been examined in relation to the Apollo flight in 1975. Recently, artificial intelligence Popov has started working on the Gemini flights. Recently, I found a new series of articles by Popov, The Gemini Scam, from October 2, 2015, in which he also concludes that April 12, 1981 became the first day when Americans carried out their first manned flight. Step 5. Analysis of the first Soviet manned space flights from 1961-1965. Block number 3. The relatively scarce criticism found online so far is limited to the alleged falsification of Gagarin's flight and Leonov's spacewalk. But according to the proposed version, all Vostok and Voskhod flights are under suspicion. Therefore, we will study the circumstances calmly and impartially, like investigators or surgeons, regardless of the authority of the people involved and without fear of reaching a result that may be unpleasant for someone. Here, through the links, you can delve into the magical world of the mystification of the first space flights of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics and the United States of America.